About 750 million years ago, a collared, flagellated eukaryotic cell started to aggregate in clumps, who knows why, beginning the leap to multicellularity that would eventually lead to what we now know as animals.
This made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move.
The two earliest lineages of animals for which exemplar species still exist are sponges and comb jellies. Zoologists currently cannot agree which one came first. Both have very simple body plans, and while sponges at first glance would seem obviously more primitive, lacking any kind of organized tissues, let alone organs, for fuck's sake, you can put a sponge in a blender, pour out the result, and the sponge will eventually reform. But surprisingly, they have more in common genetically with the rest of the animals than the comb jellies do. More complex are the cnidarians, some of which have very sophisticated anatomies, including complex eyes, but they lack brains or even heads. Also, they poop out their mouths because they only got one hole. Naturally, the next step was to add a second hole, making the rest of the animal family, called bilaterians, essentially a tube. Food goes in one end and out the other. But evolution can only work with existing structures, so one of those holes has to form first, and the bilateral animals are divided by which choice they made. Protostomes grow the mouth first, while deuterostomes grow the anus first. You are a deuterostome. You had a butt before you had a mouth. And one of your distant deuterostome ancestors started to aggregate hardened, even calcified material around its brain and spinal cord in order to protect its nervous system, resulting in vertebrates. The simplest of those is the lamprey, which doesn't even have a jaw, just that second hole that it surrounds with lots of teeth to latch onto prey. But turns out jaws are real useful, so there aren't that many species of lamprey left being outcompeted by its cousins that decided being able to open and shut the mouth hole was important. Thus we have fish, some of which felt that water wasn't good enough for them and crawled onto land, and their kids became frogs and salamanders, some of which started to calcify their eggs too so they wouldn't dry out on land, and they became reptiles. This is a very diverse group, including modern crocodiles and snakes and turtles, as well as birds, which evolved from the now extinct dinosaurs. But some of them started to care for their young by secreting a nutrient-rich fluid from specialized glands, and we call them mammals. Most mammals have hair and give live birth rather than laying eggs. Of interest to us today are two lineages of mammals, one that's specialized very much into murdering other animals, aptly named carnivores, and one that was selected more for a generalist diet, tool use, and overall intelligence, the primates. Because one of those primates, Homo sapiens, began a very special relationship with one of those carnivores, Canis lupus. This is not the first instance of one species domesticating another. Leafcutter ants and similar species have been literally farming fungus for food for tens of millions of years, to the point where the fungus they cultivated is a distinct species from its wild relatives. However, dogs were the first animal that humans domesticated. Defining domestication is also hotly debated, but in general it requires that a species be changed by the intervention of another species, typically humans, for the benefit of that second species. In the case of dogs, it is most likely that wild wolves approached human encampments with their warm fires and easily accessible food supplies, and the two species entered into a symbiotic relationship, with the humans providing food and warmth and ear scritches, as well as protecting baby wolves, while the wolves helped the humans hunt and helped guard their encampments with their keener sense of smell. But pretty quickly, humans took the reins of that relationship, as they were able to control which wolves were able to breed with which other wolves. It is thus through artificial selection that Canis familiaris, or dogs, separated from wolves. Over time, humans realized there was a lot of latent genetic variety within wolves and were able to selectively breed dogs for different purposes: hunting, guarding, herding other domesticated animals, and even sitting in a human lap as a status symbol. But despite all of that diversity, all these varietals can still breed with each other, making them still all one species. In fact, most dogs can still have viable and fertile puppies with wild wolves, though facilitating such an interaction is inherently dangerous, given that wolves are predators, and the offspring has no guarantee of behaving well around humans, because everything that makes dogs so friendly with humans is genetic. You do not need to train dogs to be nice to humans. It is literally genetic instinct to them to do so. Now, getting them to understand verbal commands or gestures is a different story. That's why dogs still need to be trained. Hell, human babies need to be taught how to use toilets. But this is the main difference between an actually domesticated animal and a tamed wild animal. A domesticated domesticated animal sees humans as friends and will want to interact with humans. A wild animal will be suspicious of humans and will need to be trained to behave well with them. There is a very non-zero chance of a wild animal hurting its owner who wanted an exotic pet simply because that animal does not understand how to interact with humans or does not want to interact with humans. Quite a few people have died because they tried to keep a wild animal as a pet. By contrast, domesticated animals generally only hurt humans when they have been mistreated or when they have been trained to do so. But what makes us humans so special? The entire definition of domestication revolves around an animal's relationship to our own species. Sure, we're smart, we use tools, we can grunt and point at each other to communicate, but none of those things are unique to Homo sapiens. Many species have been found to be highly intelligent. Many species will use tools, even making their own tools, and many species have highly complex methods of communication. You might say, well, we build houses, but so do birds and termites. You might say we have a profound impact on our environment, but so do ants and beavers. You might say we have culture, but so do elephants and whales. Elephants will bury and mourn their dead, and whales and dolphins will pass on fads, like wearing dead fish heads as hats. The one thing that really makes humans unique is our insistence that we're different. And through our smartness and our tools and our grunting and pointing, we have managed to position ourselves at the top of every food chain on this planet. But does that give us the right to do whatever we want with all the other animals? The idea of treating non-human animals with dignity is a surprisingly ancient one. The Indic religions of Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism are millennia old, and many of their adherents have been moral vegetarians for thousands of years. For the ancient Greeks, there was a bit more debate around the issue, with Aristotle asserting that animals are stupid and people are smart, that we can do whatever we want with them, while Theophrastus, one of his pupils, thought Aristotle was stupid and that animals shouldn't be killed for food. A couple hundred years later, Plutarch argued that while he believed only humans had rights under the law, treating animals well was indicative of good moral character. Perhaps the first instance of non-human animals having legal rights in a modern sense in the Western world is from Nathaniel Ward's Body of Liberties, which was the legal code for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. While protecting the usual freedom of speech and right to a jury trial, it also contains the following: "No man shall exercise any tyranny or cruelty toward any brute creature which are usually kept for man's use." Through the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, many philosophers expressed opinions for and against animal rights. Often, animal rights were used as a vehicle to push a political agenda. In the first decade of the 1900s, suffragettes backed the anti-vivisection movement, protesting against performing experiments on live animals by making comparisons to their own feminist struggles. Later in the 1930s, Nazis surprisingly championed animal rights, but in an effort to blur the line between humans and animals to make their persecutions of Jews more palatable. Author Dodie Smith had some opinions on this subject, making them known in her most famous work, The 101 Dalmatians, published in 1956. Unlike several more recent authors who voluminously express their various opinions in interviews and on blogs and whatnot, Smith seems to have mostly confined her thoughts and feelings to her published works, which include some autobiographies, plays, and children's novels. As far as I can tell, Smith never attended an animal rights rally or sent a letter to the editor disclaiming, "I support the rights of animals," but The 101 Dalmatians is not particularly subtle with its messaging. In fact, it might be the least subtle book I've ever read. Oh, and Smith was a Christian Scientist, which will be relevant later. Only a year after the book's publication, Walt Disney swooped in and bought the film rights to it, which his company has held onto with a vice grip ever since. Walt gave the book to Bill Peet, making him the first writer to have sole story credit on a Disney animated film. Remember Alice in Wonderland had 13? For the most part, Peet stuck quite closely to the novel with his adaptation, mostly condensing characters. Originally, Perdita was a separate character from Pongo's wife, Mrs., and Cruella de Vil had a cat and a husband, and Anita and Roger had two nannies who, to my queer eyes, read like a cute old lesbian couple, and the sheepdog Colonel had a little boy, Tommy, who is surprisingly instrumental in helping the puppies escape. Some of the changes make sense, like dropping a scene where a group of Romani try to steal the Dalmatians to sell them, which is just very racist, and let's all be grateful to Bill Peet for cutting that. Other changes I can discern no reason for, like changing the name of one of the henchmen from Saul to Horace, and changing the gender of a couple characters. Sergeant Tibbs and the 15th stillborn puppy are both girls in the original book. Still, despite force masking our favorite one-drop in Lorcana, I was surprised by how faithfully Bill Pete cleaved to the source material, with several direct quotations.
Any way you like, poison them, drown them, bash them in the head. You got any chloroform?
Not a drop. And no ether. Either.
And the show What's My Crime is also lifted straight from the book. For those who don't understand this reference, there was a TV show from the 50s called What's My Line, where a panel of minor celebrities would try to guess 20 question style the occupation of various guests. It's actually quite an entertaining show with lots of fun and weird jobs showcased, and What's My Crime is one of my favorite parodies of anything.
Mr. Fawnswater is a burglar by trade, but in this case his crime was not burglary.
But with all these changes, Dodie Smith actually felt that Pete had improved upon her novel, writing to tell him as much when she was shown his storyboards. So what's so unsubtle about the 101 Dalmatians? Well, we have a story where 2 Dalmatians own 2 humans in the book called Mr. and Mrs. Dearly, and yes, in this narrative universe, dogs are the point of view and they believe the pet relationship is the other way around, and those 2 dogs have puppies which are coveted by and eventually stolen by a woman named Cruella de Vil, Cruel Devil, and her hired goons have the last name Baden, which is just a Briticism for a bad guy in a movie. Cruella most of all covets furs.
I live for furs. I worship furs.
To the point where she views animals purely by the value she can extract from them rather than as thinking and feeling creatures in their own right. In the book, she complains about her cat, saying she'd drown it if it weren't so inherently valuable, though she regularly drowns the cat's kittens, which are sired by various strays in the neighborhood. Please spay and neuter your pets, y'all. And of course, Cruella only steals those puppies because she wants a spotted fur coat made from Dalmatian skin.
I only wish to have a coat made out of puppies.
Why would you do that?
Out of all the villains in the canon, Cruella is probably the one with the least sympathetic motivation, which is probably one reason why it took so long to add her to villainous despite her high profile in Disney's marketing. Also in the book, she's constantly putting too much pepper on her food, to the point where when one of the puppies bites her, she tastes like pepper. Yes, the devil woman peppers everything, keeps a roaring fire going in every room, and wears furs everywhere, subtle as a brick. The book constantly has pieces of dialogue and character interactions and passages of narration that hammer home the message that dogs and cats should be treated well and certainly not killed for their furs. Perdita was very, very frightened. Now that she was no longer useful, why should the Dearlys keep her in this warm, comfortable house where, for the first time in her life, she had been given enough to eat? But it was not the food and warmth that mattered most to her, it was the love. She had been treated as one of the family. The thought of leaving it all was more than she could bear. And what happened to dogs nobody wanted? All sorts of fears awoke in her heart. Pete's version of the story kind of pulls back from the on-the-noseness of the book, and certainly Cruella de Vil feels a bit more natural as a name when you hear it aloud rather than read it. Instead of passages like the one I just read, which may as well be air raid sirens shrieking, "Be nice to dogs!" The Disney film instead simply invests you in the canine characters, achieving the same end through empathy rather than preachiness. As Disney was getting ready to start animating Pete's storyboards, Sleeping Beauty happened, the most expensive and time-consuming project the studio had yet tackled, only to bomb at the box office. If the studio was going to continue, costs had to be reduced, and extensive layoffs were instituted. Enter Ub Iwerks. Now, I say enter, but Ub had been there from the literal beginning. He co-created Oswald and Mickey and was the main animator for Steamboat Willie. However, in the 30s, he tried making his own animation studio, which never really went anywhere, leading him right back to Disney in 1940 when the studio had started tackling feature productions. Rather than going back to character animation, Iwerks stayed mostly in the background, doing special effects animation and working on new technology. He co-invented the sodium vapor process of background removal, which to this day remains superior to either blue screen or green screen, and he pioneered using xerography in animation, which is what saved the company and marks the transition from the restoration of the 50s to the era of the Scratchies. Why do I call them Scratchies? Prior to the 60s, the sketches of the animators were transferred by hand by human inkers onto celluloid, and those line illustrations were then colored in by colorists. Throughout the 40s and 50s, the Disney studio had the world's premier paint mixing operation, and the ink lines could be any number of colors, as was showcased in Sleeping Beauty. With xerography, that middle inking step was now done by machine, basically a photocopier, transferring animator sketches directly onto transparent celluloid to immediately be colored. This was both a time saver and a cost saver, as it meant that the entire inking department could now be laid off. As I mentioned in my very first video about the history of Disney animation, this had the unintended consequence of removing most of the women at the studio, because the animators were, with one exception, all men, while women were used for the inking and coloring. Regardless, while the Xerox was faster and cheaper, it was also, well, less good. Firstly, for the better part of 2 decades, the photocopier could only print in black ink, ending the ability to have subtlety with those ink lines. Secondly, the human inkers could tell which lines were important and which were leftover drafting lines, while the photocopier just copied over everything the animator drew. This led to the new job of someone erasing those draft lines, which would upset the animators. Milt Kahl in particular refused to let anyone erase anything from his drawings, so you can tell which ones are his by those still visible drafting lines. It is those chunky black outlines and those extraneous sketch marks that give these films a scratchy aesthetic, a term coined by the unshaved mouse. It makes the films feel rougher, making it more obvious that what you're watching was drawn by hand. And I feel that this change in aesthetic is a more important shift for Disney's output than Walt's death a few years later, which is why I disagree with the Silver/Bronze Age convention. And the studio itself agrees with me. In their behind-the-scenes videos for both films, the animators and animation historians call Sleeping Beauty
the end of an era, in many ways.
That is why, until Disney finally figured out how to make the photocopier print in a color other than black, we are now in the scratchy era.
Oh, balderdash.
Now, the Disney studio didn't want to dive into xerography purely untested, risking millions of dollars on a film that the public might spurn again. Parts of the Forest of Thorns sequence in Sleeping Beauty were done via Xerox, as they were gonna have black lines anyway, and you probably never even noticed until I told you just now. In addition, Disney tested out Xerox on a short, Goliath 2. It's honestly kind of insufferably tedious, but the Xerox animation certainly worked. It also used another cost-saving measure, that of recycling animation, which would become rather a habit of director Wolfgang Reitherman. This short steals from basically every canon film that came out before 1960. See if you can find all of them. You can watch the short on YouTube. And the elephant animation for the short was largely recycled for the Jungle Book a few years later. The final cost-saving measure for 101 Dalmatians was going back to full screen, which was less expensive than widescreen, which required much larger drawings and backgrounds. Disney would not do another widescreen film until The Black Cauldron. But by the 1960s, most theaters had converted to widescreen and couldn't properly show a film in the standard Academy ratio. So the scratchies were actually cropped into widescreen in order to show in theaters. The full-screen versions of those films released on home video are actually the original versions. Now, despite priming the public response for this aesthetic shift with Goliath 2, there was still no hiding the sudden change, so Disney decided to showcase what was now possible with this new technology right in the opening credits. In many ways, Dalmatians were the perfect fit for xerography, being black and white already, and as the credits roll, we see a myriad of them copy-pasted across the screen. That would have been horrendously time-consuming with hand inking, but with xerography, you can just reprint the same drawing over and over on different parts of the celluloid. These credits are one of the best Disney has ever made, endlessly inventive, with spots all over everything, even turning into musical notes to show off George Bruns's score. And man, Tchaikovsky was certainly not a crutch. This guy can write music. At one point, there's even a brief nod to Ladies' theme. We also get our first look at the backgrounds for this film, which are almost the exact opposite of Eyvind Earl's maximalist painted relief on the tree paintings for Sleeping Beauty. Here we get a different sort of impressionism, with the backgrounds having a modernist, almost cubist sensibility and these rectangles of color with black line work over top. This was done intentionally. Ken Anderson, who helmed the backgrounds for this film, wanted them to match the aesthetic of the moving characters, in many ways the same sensibility that Eyvind Earl had gone for.
Create a total synthesis between character and background.
just with scratchy xerography rather than painstaking hand painting. However, in the end, Walt Disney didn't like how the film looked, feeling that the switch to xerography was a betrayal of sorts, preferring the lush artistry of the Golden Age and the Restoration, even though it was necessary to keep the company afloat. Don't worry, Walt, you'll only be around for one more movie after this one anyway. Keep smoking those cigarettes. Just as with Lady and the Tramp, our two main characters here are dogs, Pongo and Perdita, animated by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. However, they only did the outlines. All those spots were done by a whole other squad hired specifically for that task. As with prior animal-focused films, actual Dalmatians were brought in for Frank and Ollie and the other animators to reference. I think you'll agree these images are adorable. Milt Kahl, meanwhile, tackled the human couple, and that's why there's visible sketch lines all over Roger's face. The other main human, Cruella, was animated by Mark Davis, who is just so good at villains. Those cheekbones could cut butter. There is a fair bit of similarity in how Maleficent and Cruella are animated, but Davis manages to give DeVille an insidiousness all her own.
Do you understand?
A lot of animation buffs like to assert that 101 Dalmatians was the first contemporary film the studio made, but no, that was Dumbo, and plenty of segments from the package era took place in then modern day. What is unique about this film is its blending of the human and animal storylines. In Lady and the Tramp, the focus is squarely on the dogs, but here, Cruella, Anita, and Roger are given just as much attention as Pongo, Perdita, and the puppies. Our film opens upon Roger and Pongo's shared bachelor flat with our human lost in the sauce at his piano and our Dalmatian bored out of his gourd. I promise this video isn't going to be oops all nitpicks, but I do want to mention that in the book, Mr. Dearly is an accountant who has performed some undescribed service for the government and thus has unlimited access to money. There is never any tension with regards to budget. If the Dearlys need to buy something, they just buy it. They can afford it. By contrast, Roger of the film is a starving artist, which I think makes it more impactful later when they decide to keep the puppies. This was a good adaptational choice by Bill Pete. Anyway, Pongo realizes his hyper-focused human is never going to find a femoid on his own, but luckily for him, apparently the city put on a parade today of woman-dog pairs purely for his amusement. Pongo finally espies another Dalmatian, pulling along a human lady he thinks Roger will like the look of, and drags his man out to the park to ensnare them. This whole sequence definitely leans misogynist, basically putting women on a sushi belt for a man to peruse to his liking, though I now realize I just described Tinder. Nonetheless, it's cleverly animated and entertaining, and Roger offering Anita his wet handkerchief is a meet-cute for the ages. Though even here we can see Reitherman's propensity for reusing animation. Roger identically puffs on his pipe 3 times, and Pongo's pulling on the leash as he searches is also used more than once. I wouldn't say this film cut corners, but they definitely tried to spend as little money as possible. Roger and Anita then get hitched along with their respective Dalmatians, but apparently the studio changed this scene to avoid committing sacrilege by having dogs partake in an actual religious matrimony. Notice how Anita isn't wearing a wedding dress? And this is largely why Disney films are secular, not because the animators are rabid atheists, but because upsetting religious viewers by portraying their faith inaccurately tends to lose you money. It's the capitalist profit motive, not moral principles. Speaking of moral principles, here comes Cruella de Vil with the loudest car horn in all England. Her entrance is iconic, framed in the door window before slamming poor Nanny into the wall. She's a walking contradiction, simultaneously massive with her enormous fur, yet skinny as a stick underneath. Her voice actress, Betty Lou Gerson, is American, but gives a fairly convincing upper-crust British accent.
Cheerio, cheerio, darling.
While also being caustically sarcastic.
And poor Roger is your bold and fearless Sir Galahad.
And where Anita is demure and mindful and feminine, Cruella is brash and loud and masculine. Even the way she walks suggests a pair of steel balls between her legs. While in the book she's got a husband, film Cruella is very much lesbian-coded, much more interested in furs than any sort of attention from men.
Why, you horrid men.
She struts around like she owns the place, putting out her cigarettes into Anita's tea and crumpets and blasting her green smoke everywhere. Hey Walt, are you watching? Maybe cut back a little before— hell, he can't hear me. Cruella is here to visit her old school chum, Anita, and check in on her dogs and impending puppies with the most threatening compliments you'll ever hear.
Such perfectly beautiful coats.
It's immediately obvious to Pongo and Perdita that there is something off about her, and we, the audience, can see from a mile away that Cruella has plans. plans for those puppies. At least Roger is wise to her nonsense, and her appearance gives him the inspiration he needs to write the lyrics for his new song.
You've seen her kind of eyes, watching you from underneath a rock.
And it's here I want to note that this film is surprisingly light on songs. There's just the Cruella song, the Canine Crunchies TV jingle, and Dalmatian Plantation at the end. All the rest of the music is just George Bruns' score, not that I'm complaining, but it does make 101 Dalmatians stand out in a canon that is largely a cavalcade of musicals. What few songs there are all diegetic, sung by in-universe singers intended to be viewed as actually happening, and not just artistic license to showcase their characters' big feelings.
How is it you all know the words? Did you rehearse?
Yeah, every Thursday. Didn't you see the flyers?
An amusing side effect of this is Cruella is unknowingly hearing her own musical theme at the same time we are. The birth of the puppies is a great little showcase of narrative tension, with Nanny running in and out of the kitchen to give the anxious Pongo and Roger updates, Lucky getting a second chance at life, only for Cruella to swoop back in and demand the entire litter be sold to her. I do appreciate that Anita isn't just a meek nothing of a character. She very firmly, if apologetically, informs Cruella that the puppies are not for sale. This after spending hours personally midwifing for Perdita. However, it takes Anita's husband more angrily backing her up for Cruella to realize they're not going to be convinced to sell. When Roger stands up to her, she drops any pretense and basically admits the crime she's about to commit.
I'll get even. Just wait. You'll be sorry. You fools. You idiots.
If only real-life villains confessed so easily, and in advance, too! Enter Horace and Jasper, my beloveds, my problematic henchman faves. These bumbling brothers are a delight, and a lot of that comes down to the performance of the voice actors, particularly J. Pat O'Malley as Jasper.
Ah, now, come off it, Ducky. We got no time to palaver.
Who I'm surprised I haven't talked about yet. He's been in quite a few of these films.
A bit of a trotter, a bit of a rotter.
He was a fantastic character actor with the perfect amount of presence to make every single one of his supporting roles memorable without overshadowing the main characters.
If you think we're waxworks, you ought to pay, you know. Contrary to us, if you think we're alive, you ought to speak to us.
At any rate, the two Baddens con their way into Anita and Roger's home.
We're from the gas company. Electric. Eh? Electric company.
And poor Nanny keeps getting shoved behind the door. Give that poor woman a raise. At first she thinks they're there to steal valuables, not realizing they were taking the most priceless items in the house, the puppies.
Police! Help! The puppies! Police! Somebody help me! Help!
We then cut to Cruella gloating over the crime she's just gotten away with, which reminds her to phone Anita to get her alibi straight, though of course Roger isn't buying any of it.
Is she calling to confess?
And that lime green cigarette smoke is just as insidious as Maleficent's flames, just immaculate design work there, A+. Though I still find it hilarious that in Villainous her ashtray was censored into a candy dish. It's also fascinating how old Disney used smoking. Cruella's fumes are a nauseating miasma, while Roger's pipe barely produces a puff. Tobacco is used here to inform character, and Disney would use this visual tool right up to the turning of the millennium when smoking cartoon characters were banned in advertising, and most children's media followed suit for good reason. With the humans unable to do anything, Pongo and Perdita contact the Twilight Bark, passing the news of stolen puppies from dog to dog all across England. This sequence is full of cameos from Lady and the Tramp, again using a lot of recycled animation. The bark chain ends at Colonel, Captain, and Sergeant Tibbs, who happen to live next to guess who?
You mean the old DeVille place?
Where Tibbs finds not just 15 puppies, but
99?
So, real talk, you're keeping just under 100 small dogs in a single room. That place has to be just covered in turds and piss stains. There is no way that place is kept in anywhere near a sanitary condition, certainly not with Horace and Jasper in charge. Why is that? Well, their faces are glued to the telly, as the Brits call it. While television had existed through the first half of the 20th century, it was in the 50s that it really took off. At the end of World War II, only a few thousand American households owned a TV TV set. By 1960, almost every American home had one. In the following decades, many Americans scheduled their lives around television, eating their TV dinners in front of it and making sure to be home in time for their favorite programs. The iconic image of the nuclear family of the 1960s is mom, dad, and two kids plopped in front of the TV, staring adoringly. And Disney was right there from the beginning with what eventually became known as the Wonderful World of Disney, premiering in 1954. From then, Disney advertised their new films on television and started to broadcast old ones for special occasions. They even used some of their old silly symphonies in 101 Dalmatians for Jasper, Horace, and the puppies to watch. Earlier in the film, the commercial for Canine Crunchies is a direct send-up of advertising of the time.
You can be a champion too if you eat canine crunchies.
And that's probably why so many people view 101 Dalmatians as the first contemporary entry in the canon, because it's the first to acknowledge television. That's what makes it feel so modern and so different from its peers. It's commercialized. It's even more prominent in the book, where Cadpig, that stillborn 15th puppy who was originally a girl, becomes obsessed with TV while kidnapped, asking her mother to convince the Dearlys to get one once they're home. This then leads into the weirdest scene in the novel, where the puppies spend the night in a church during their escape. Cadpig finds the manger scene and thinks it's Telly, except better than Telly for reasons she can't explain. Because television had replaced religion as the opiate of the masses, and Christian Scientist Dodie Smith was grumpy about that. Because why the hell would a dog care about baby Jesus? It feels very forced, and I'm very glad that Bill Peet did not include it in the film. Speaking of, where were we? Right. Now knowing where their stolen children are, Pongo and Perdita take matters into their own paws and sprint across the snowy English countryside. At this point, Cruella, sensing that the jig is up, rolls up to Hell Hall, stomping across the miraculously turdless floor to yell at her minions.
Police are everywhere. I want the job done tonight.
Real talk again, Cruella is an idiot. She's clever, she's devious, and she's an idiot. Except for those last 15, the puppies were all legally acquired.
Oh no, we're not stolen. We're bought and paid for.
And no one was looking for them. If she'd just stuck to those 84, she would have gotten away with her horrible Dalmatian fur farm, and no one would have cared. But because she stole this last batch, it all comes crumbling down like her shitty ceiling when she slams the door too hard. That said, Cruella is also fantastic as a villain. Prior villains have been evil, and we've wanted to see them taken down, but Cruella, I think, is the first who is legitimately frightening. She has no compunctions against doing whatever it takes to get whatever she wants, and will sneer at you malevolently the entire time.
I don't care how you kill the little beast, but do it! And do it now!
I think she means it, Jasper.
Sergeant Tibbs recognizes that while shit hasn't hit the floor, it's certainly hit the fan, and organizes an escape while Horace and Jasper procrastinate.
Yeah, we'll get on with it as soon as the show's over.
There is a tense chase through the house, culminating in the puppies getting cornered only for Mom and Dad to show up just in time and bite some ass.
Oh! Jasper!
Once they've flown the coop and have some relative safety, Pongo and Perdita realize the scope of the situation. It's not just their puppies. Lucky whispered, "Father, are you going to rescue them all?" "I hope so," said Pongo earnestly, wondering more and more how he was going to manage it. "I told them you would, but they've been pretty nervous. I'll just send word round that they can count on you." He whispered to a pup at the end of the row, and the word traveled like wind over a cornfield. There was barely a sound that a human ear could have heard, except a couple tail thumps, instantly repressed. All knew they must not give away the fact that Pongo was in their midst, and when he went silently along the rows there was scarcely a movement. But he could feel great waves of love and trust rolling towards him, and suddenly all the pups were real and living for him, not just a problem he had to face. He felt as if he were the father of them all, and he knew that he could never desert them. He felt a special sympathy for the big pups in the two back rows. Some of them were fully half-grown, young dogs rather than puppies, lollopy creatures with clumsy feet. They made him remember his own, not very far away youth. He wondered how long their skins would be safe from Cruella. Would she have the patience to wait much longer? Did the big pups know danger grew closer every day? Something in their eyes told him they did. The subject of animal intelligence is, like basically every other subject, a controversial one. Zoologists debate how best to test for it, or if it's even measurable at all. In the Lady and the Tramp video I mentioned the mirror test, but as I said then, dogs fail that test, yet still no one doubts that dogs have intelligence. They're able to follow commands we give them, they're able to intuit our emotional state and act accordingly, and of course, they're the reigning hide-and-seek champions versus the foxes. Dogs are basically universally beloved, to the point where the idea of eating a dog or wearing dog skin as clothing is seen not just as gauche, but taboo and morally repugnant. No one sits down and watches this film and thinks, yes, Cruella is a reasonable businesswoman, I see nothing wrong with this profit-making scheme. But you know what other animals are smart? Pigs. Multiple tests have shown that pigs are about as intelligent as human toddlers and definitely more clever than dogs. They make very affectionate pets, able to learn just as many tricks as dogs, and yet in the Western world, killing and eating pigs is so common that we have multiple different words for the meat we get from them. Ham, pork, bacon, trotters, chitterlings, pork belly, pancetta. Pigs were domesticated to eat our trash, breed as quickly as possible, then be slaughtered for us to consume. Unless you've made a conscious choice not to wear animal products, you probably own an article of clothing made from pig leather, if not a wallet or a purse. If you're Jewish or Muslim, you're probably feeling real good about yourself right now, but you know who else is smart? Cows! Or should I say beef, steak, brisket, sirloin, veal. And cow leather is a lot more common than pig leather. Why are we culturally fully okay with eating and wearing these intelligent animals, but not dogs? I'm going to leave that question open for now, but I want you to be thinking about your answer as we continue. The 101 Dalmatians are racing across the countryside, and Cruella and her henchies are in hot pursuit in their respective vehicles. Those vehicles, by the way, were another Ub Iwerks idea. Under his direction, the animators built 3D models of them, drawing dark lines around the edges, and then just took stop-motion photos of them directly onto celluloid. It's basically a kind of motion capture, and it was yet another cost-saving measure. Even the snow Cruella drives up at the end was animated this way. They just took pictures of the Roadster model driving up sand, which is how they got it to move so weirdly realistically. The two teams play cat and mouse for a little bit before Pongo hits on the idea of covering themselves in soot to pretend to be Labradors.
We're gonna fool the old mad lady.
I can't tell if this is blackface or not. I'm so tired because of woke or something. I'm leaning toward this doesn't deserve a dopey ding because the actual Labrador is right there and he's cool with it, and it is honestly a pretty clever idea. Horace, though, is suspicious, but Jasper tells him off.
Dogs is always painting themselves black. You idiot!
Cruella, however, decides to not be an idiot for once and realizes what's going on just as the disguised Dalmatians head off as stowaways in a moving van. And this is where Cruella becomes truly terrifying, fully willing to run this van off the road.
Birdie, watch out! Crazy woman driver!
Even after being shoved into a ditch, Cruella is not willing to let things go. Give that fucking car a Lorcana card, please, God, it's all I want for Christmas. Cruella is finally done in by her poor choice in employees, as well as her mistreatment of them.
Oh, you imbecile!
Shut up.
And the dogs make it home just in time for Christmas. Roger and Anita keep all the new puppies, the end. I do like that in contrast to the ending of Lady and the Tramp. This feels more like a systematic correction. Roger and Anita adopt all the dogs. They have the means to do so, and so they do. No one is left in the pound this time. That said, how did Roger not get sued for libel over this song?
Cruella de Vil, Cruella de...
101 Dalmatians was a smashing success, breaking box office records for an animated film, and was even the most watched movie in France in 1961. Xerography had paid off handsomely, and there was now no going back, even if Walt missed his golden age. That success led it to be one of the very first to be remade in live action, way back in the 90s. And what's this? Camera work? Cinematography? A competent understanding of film language?
You are really spoiling us.
Jokes aside, Glenn Close really was the perfect choice for a live-action Cruella. But that's not the end of the story. Dodie Smith actually wrote a sequel called The Starlight Barking. It's about the dog Rapture. Nope, that wasn't a sneeze. You heard me correctly. Buckle yourselves in for this one. So Pongo and Perdido awake one morning to find all the humans are still asleep, but all the dogs now have magic powers. They can open doors by thinking at them, and they can fly. Most of the novel is kind of nothing, just the dogs wondering what's going on and exploring what their new mind powers can do. Remember how I mentioned Smith was a Christian Scientist? I highly recommend Knowing Better's video about this particular sect, but to summarize, their core belief is that you can fix things by thinking hard enough about them. If you're sick, it's 'cause you're thinking wrong. Mrs. said, I think metaphysical means magic, a kind of magic that comes from our own minds. That's why we're able to open doors today and talk direct to Cadpig, and swoosh, oh, Pongo, I like metaphysical. I don't think I do, said Pongo. I don't think I like things I don't understand. That's because you have such a splendid brain. My brain understands so little that it loves things it's not supposed to understand. Anyway, I've taken to metaphysical. It's basically that whole, you only use 10% of your brain myth, because if you use 10% of your brain for 10 seconds, you'll realize that there's no way in hell you would evolve 90% unused jiggly fat inside your skull. Brains take a lot of calories to keep going. Why would you waste all that fuel on an organ that mostly does nothing? At any rate, the sequel culminates with Dog Jesus descending from Sirius the Dog Star and asking the dogs if they want to come with him to
one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism.
Because soon the humans will nuke themselves to death.
Space!
It sounds ridiculous, and it is, but after the dogs collectively decide to stay with the humans, it becomes surprisingly poignant. So the answer is no, and it comes not only from you, all you dogs here in London. I can hear it from all over the world, and I know now that there could not be any other answer. Of all creatures, dogs have lived closest to mankind, and they will never desert mankind. And though I do not think such devotion is deserved, I can admire it. And it is something in men's favor that they can inspire it, and, in their way, return it. May you never regret your choice, O dogs of the world. At the very beginning of this video, I briefly rushed through the history of animal evolution, specifically along the path to vertebrates and mammals. Once a human sperm fertilizes a human egg, that path is recreated, an evolutionary dance performed over and over again. You start as a clump of cells no more distinguished than a sponge, and you form a big hole like the mouth butt of a jellyfish. Then you grow your second hole, turning into a tube like a flatworm. You grow a brain and a spinal cord and bones around them, and you become a little fish. You even grow a little tail for a while as you look like a frog, then a lizard, then almost like a little dog before you become recognizably human. Because you are an animal. You're not special. You're not different. You can stand on two legs, you have opposable thumbs to grab things, you can speak in a language that allows the communication of complex ideas, and you wear clothing often made from the skins of other animals, but you are still yourself an animal. And how do we treat our fellow animals? Certainly not with the dignity that Plutarch or the Buddha would have wanted us to. Cows and pigs and chickens are shoved into factory farms, kept in pens where they cannot move, fed a nutrient-poor, high-calorie diet to make them big and fat as cheaply as possible, and then slaughtered for their resources. And that's just how we treat our fellow mammals. In recent years, we've started to realize just how intelligent crabs and cephalopods are. Hell, octopi might be just as smart as humans, and for many people, those animals are just tasty seafood. To test scientific hypotheses, we use rats, injecting them with serums and running them through mazes and shocking them and feeding them poisons and drugs. We've been doing this for so long that lab rats, while not yet their own species, are nonetheless physiologically distinct from their wild relatives. Without them, much of science today would never have been done. It would have been impossible. There's actually a monument to laboratory mice in Russia showing a slightly anthropomorphized mouse knitting a strand of DNA. Animals have been perhaps the single most important resource in humanity's success, and we treat them like shit. And Dodie Smith was one of them. She clearly adored dogs and cats, but that didn't stop her from eating meat or wearing furs. Her 2 Dalmatian books constantly mention what the dogs eat, and it's mostly meat. And before a specific group starts getting in the comments, I will mention that while yes, cats are obligate carnivores and cannot be fed a meatless diet, dogs are omnivores, just like humans. Yet despite Smith's specificity in which animals she thought deserved special treatment, her readers and the watchers of the Disney film have taken her message much more broadly than she intended. While vegetarian groups have existed for thousands of years, it's only in the latter half of the 20th century that they really started to be taken seriously in the Western world. And at the same time, anti-fur movements began to appear. However, there has also been pushback against them. Some of this has been reactionary and conservative, but some groups, in particular PETA, have deserved it. The People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, have become notorious even among other animal rights activists for their callousness toward the animals they are purporting to protect. PETA itself has acknowledged that they euthanize over 95% of the animals they receive at their shelter. Not quite as bad is the vegan movement, which is mostly just viewed as insufferable and pretentious. While vegetarians simply abstain from meat and killing animals, vegans refuse to use any animal product whatsoever. No milk or dairy products, no eggs, no honey, no wool, no food dyes made from dead beetles. And certainly it is possible for humans to get all their nutrition from plant sources. However, while I personally could accustom myself to a meatless lifestyle, I will never go vegan. Why? Let's take sheep for an example. As a species, humans domesticated them, shaping their evolutionary path to best suit our needs, providing lots of wool. But those sheep also evolved to need humans to shear them. If domesticated sheep are left to their own devices, their wool will grow unstoppably, they will overheat and become weighed down, and they will die. We got them into this mess. It is our responsibility to make sure they are taken care of and shorn properly. But now what do we do with that wool? It'd be a waste to just throw it away, not to mention that wool clothing is better for the environment than polyester, which is literally a plastic that has to be made from fossil fuels. Remember that whole climate change thing we're trying to avoid? There are many animal products that we can retrieve without hurting the animal, and that are more environmentally friendly than plant-based or petroleum-based alternatives. Not to mention that in poorer regions of the world, animals may be the only source for certain things. And just like sheep need to be shorn, domesticated cattle have to be milked, or again, they will die. So I have no issues eating ice cream or cheese. What is important to me is that the animals in question are treated well and are responsibly cared for if they require human intervention for a happy and comfortable life. Because if animals have a right to anything, after all they've done for us, happiness and comfort is the least we can give them. To me, animal rights is not just about not killing and eating them. It is actively caring for the species we have domesticated and who now rely upon us, and it is actively conserving wild species who are threatened by our environmental destruction. Refusing to eat honey isn't going to save the bees, but engaging in ethical farming and forestry practices and being more judicious in our use of pesticides will. It's not morally wrong to use animal products. It is morally wrong to mistreat the animals we take resources from, and we need to start thinking very carefully about which animals we kill and eat for food. And I haven't even touched upon what we've done to dogs. All those different dog breeds for all those different purposes, the only way to maintain those for as long as we have is through inbreeding. If you hear the word purebred, your brain needs to correct that to inbred. Now you might be thinking, Wira, there are billions of dogs. Surely there's enough genetic diversity there to prevent such things. Except remember that we spay and neuter dogs. Now this is a good thing, as it prevents feral populations that can't properly take care of themselves and pose a threat to nearby humans and pets, but it also means that realistically the reproductive populations for individual dog breeds are very small. Because of that, many pure breeds have gotten pretty fucked up. Several breeds suffer from hip dysplasia, and others, such as bulldogs and pugs, have difficulty breathing because of their squashed faces. You know which dogs don't have these problems? Mutts!
Mongrels and radical ideas.
Mixed breed dogs consistently have properly sized heads and facial features, can breathe properly, and don't suffer from the same problems because they are all genetic issues exacerbated by inbreeding. If you care about the ethical treatment of animals, particularly dogs, then do not buy a purebred dog unless you're adopting from the pound. Do not support dog breeders who inbreed. If you own a purebred dog already, make sure it is spayed or neutered, and that includes Dalmatians. Dalmatians are predisposed to skin conditions, skeletal conditions, liver problems, and are more likely than other breeds to be deaf. And you know what happened after Dodie Smith's book and Disney's film? People in the US and UK adopted Dalmatians in droves and then mostly abandoned them because Dalmatians aren't lap dogs. They require a lot of care and attention that many families are just not prepared to give. We like to say that dogs are man's best friend, but if that's really the case, we need to start being dog's best friend in return. I mentioned in the Bambi video that someone convicted of poaching was mandated to watch the film by court order as part of his punishment, and honestly I'd put 101 Dalmatians on a similar level. The film deftly showcases proper treatment of animals, showing the audience how a dog's life can be made happy or horrible by their owner's actions. The villains of this piece consistently treat animals poorly, handling them roughly and smacking them aside, even when they're not actively trying to murder them. The only time Roger ever grabs Pongo is when he's deliberately being a doofus, and even then does so in a way that doesn't actually hurt him. Cruella wants to kill dogs for fashion. Roger brings a stillborn puppy back to life. And it certainly helps that the movie is a rip-roaring good time, full of vibrant animation, memorable performances, and a fantastic musical score. We have certainly started off the Scratchy era with a bang. As ever, I am grateful to my Patreon patrons, particularly Elijah Black, Gurgi85, Avery and their ADHDs, Jinx KB, Savannah Mighty Zebra, Tony Houst, JC Alexandre, Bewilder Eye, Jekko, and CBL. This content is sponsored by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month, or 10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. I've also announced some patron stretch goals at which I will make some fun music videos. Either way, join me next time as we discuss how best to educate with the sword in the stone.